Welcome back to Mr. Scare. For today's episode, I have a compilation of bone-chilling search and rescue stories from forest rangers that have worked in state parks and national forests. And now I'll start reading these stories. And meanwhile, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. Among all the possible situations in search and rescue, missing kids are the most heartbreaking ones. It doesn't matter what circumstances they go missing under, it's never easy, and we always dread the ones we find deceased. It's not as common, but it does happen. Many times the search and rescue teams find kids in places that they shouldn't have been in. I can honestly say I've heard about this kind of thing happening more than I've seen it, but I'll share one of the ones that I think about a lot, that I have witnessed personally. A mother and her 3 kids were out for a picnic in an area of the park that has a small lake. One was 7, one was 6, and the other was about 3. She's watching them all really closely, and according to her, she never lets them out of her sight at any time. She never saw anyone else in the area either, which is important. She packs their stuff up and they start to head back to the parking area. Now, this lake is only about 2 miles into the woods, and it's on a very clearly established trail. It's almost impossible to get lost getting from the parking area to it, unless you're deliberately going off the path like an imbecile. Her kids were walking in front of her when she heard what sounded like someone was coming up the path behind her. She turned around, and in the 4 or 5 seconds where she was not looking, her 5-year-old son vanished. She figured that he must have stepped off the trail to pee or something, and she asks her other 2 as to where he went. They both tell her that a big man with a scary face came out of the woods next to them, took the kid's hand, and led him into the trees. The 2 remaining kids didn't seem upset. In fact, she later said that it seemed like they had been drugged. They were sort of fuzzy. So she freaked out and started looking frantically in the area for her kid. She was screaming his name, and she says at one point she thought that she heard him answer her. Now obviously, she couldn't go blindly running into the woods. She had got the other 2 kids. So she called the police and they sent us out immediately. We respond and we start the search for him. Over the course of this search, which spans miles, we never find a single trace of the kid. Canines can't pick up any scent. We don't find any clothing or broken bushes or literally anything that would signify a child being there. Of course, there's suspicion about the mother for a while, but it's pretty clear that she's completely destroyed by the whole thing. We looked for this kid for weeks, with a lot of volunteer help. But eventually, the search seems useless, and we have to move on. The volunteers kept searching, though, and one day we get a call on the radio letting us know that a body has been found and needed to be recovered. They tell us the location, and none of us can believe it. We figure it has to be a different kid. But we go out there, about 15 miles from the site where he vanished, and sure enough, we find the body of the kid we've been looking for. I have been trying to figure out how this kid got where he did ever since we found him, and I've never come up with an answer. A volunteer just happened to be in the same area, because he figured he might as well look in places no one else would think of on the off chance the body had been dumped. He comes to the base of a tall, rocky slope, and halfway up, he sees something. He looks through his binoculars and sure enough, it's the body of a little boy, stuffed in a little opening in the rock. He recognizes the color of the kid's shirt, so he knows right away that it's the missing boy. That's when he calls it in, and we're dispatched. It took us almost an hour to get his body down, and none of us could believe what we were seeing. Not only was this kid 15 miles from where he'd started, but there was also no possible way he could have gotten up there on his own. This slope is treacherous, and it's hard even for us with our climbing gear. A 5-year-old boy had no way of getting up there. Not only that, but the kid doesn't have a scratch on him. His shoes are gone, but his feet aren't damaged or dirty. So it wasn't as if an animal dragged him up there. And from what we can tell, he hasn't been dead that long. He'd been out there over a month by that point, and it looked like he'd only been dead for, at most, a day or 2. The whole thing was unbelievably strange, and was one of the most disconcerting calls I've ever been on. We found out later that the coroner determined the kid had died from exposure. He'd frozen to death, probably late at night 2 days before we found him. There were no suspects and no answers. To date, it's one of the weirdest things I've ever seen, and I still don't have any logical explanations for it. I've been a search and rescue officer for multiple years now, and along the way, I've seen some things that I simply cannot explain. And I'm not bragging, but I have a damn good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time they just wander off the path or slip down a small cliff, and then they can't find their way back. The majority of these stranded or lost people have heard the old and popular "stay where you are" thing, and they don't wander far off. But I've had 2 cases where that didn't happen. Both bother me a lot, and I use them as motivation to search even harder on the missing person cases that I get called upon. The very first one was a small boy who was out picking berries with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time, both the kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked where her brother was, she told us that he'd been taken away by the bear man. She said the bear man gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, because he wanted to play with her brother for a while. When she last saw her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the so-called bear man and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was an abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair, like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched that area for weeks, and it was one of the longest search and rescue calls that I've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. And as a forest ranger, I can vouch for the fact that there are cryptids living in the deeper parts of the forests. But those areas are usually sealed off and restricted for hikers or humans in general. Unless one had wandered off from its original territory, it was impossible for the so-called bear man to have abducted the kid. The other incident was a young woman who was out hiking with her mother and her grandfather. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest while they were relaxing under the shade of the same tree. The mother was paranoid and a little extra worried about her daughter, so she was constantly speaking with her from the bottom. After a minute or 2, she stopped replying. The mother looked up and she could not spot her daughter anywhere up. It was a massive tree with hundreds of branches, but she wasn't seen anywhere. The mother called out her name a couple of times, assuming that she must have gone above the branches for the best possible view. But she never comes back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours, calling her name, before they called for help. Again, we searched everywhere, and we never found a trace of her. I have no idea where she could possibly have gone, because neither her mother nor grandfather saw her come down. And there was no other way to reach the bottom. So the only possibility is that she escaped by jumping from one tree to the other, which was near impossible unless she was trained by Tarzan or Mowgli. Or the other chilling possibility is that she was abducted by a Wendigo, who are notorious for being swift in such acts. And mind you, there are certain unexplored caves in that region that have been restricted for humans. One of my very initial jobs as a trainee as a park ranger was a search operation for a 4-year-old kid that had gotten separated from his mother. This was one of those cases where we knew we were going to find him because the dogs were on a strong scent trail and we saw clear signs that he was in the area. We ended up finding him in a berry patch about half a mile from where he'd been last seen. The kid wasn't even aware that he'd wandered that far. One of the vets brought him back, which I was glad for, because I'm really not good with kids, and I find it hard to talk to them and keep them company. As my trainer and I are headed back, she decides to take me on a detour to show me one of the hot spots where we tend to find missing people. It's a natural dip in the land near a popular trail, and people will usually move downhill because it's easier. We hike out there, it's a few miles away, and we get there in about an hour or so. As we're walking around the area and she's pointing out places she's found people in the past, I see something in the distance. Now, this area we're in is about 8 miles from the main parking area, though there are back roads you can take to get closer if you don't want to hike that far. But we're on state-protected land, which means there can't be any kind of commercial or residential development out here. The most you'll ever see is a fire tower or makeshift shelter that the homeless people feel they can get away with building. But I can see from here that whatever this thing has straight edges, and if there's one thing you learn quickly, it's that nature rarely makes straight lines. I point it out, but she doesn't say anything. She just hangs back and lets me wander over and check it out. I get within about 20 feet of it, and all the hair on the back of my neck stands up. It's a staircase. In the middle of the fucking woods. In the proper context, it would literally be the most unimaginable thing ever. It's just a normal staircase, with a beige carpet, and about 10 steps tall. But instead of being in a house, where it obviously should be, it's out here in the middle of the woods. The sides aren't carpeted, obviously, and I can see the wood it's made of. It's almost like a video game glitch, where the house has failed to load completely, and the stairs are the only thing visible. I stand there, and it's like my brain is working overtime to try and make sense of what I'm seeing. My trainer comes and stands next to me, and she just stands there casually, looking at it as if it's the least interesting thing in the world. I ask her what the heck this thing is doing here, and she just chuckles.
Get used to it, rookie. You're gonna see a lot of them.
I start to move closer, but she grabs my arm hard and she says,
I wouldn't do that.
Her voice is casual, but her grip is tight, and I just stand there looking at her.
You're gonna see them all the time, but don't go near them. Don't touch them, don't go up to them. Just ignore them.
I start to ask her about it, but something in the way she's looking at me tells me that it's best if I don't. We end up moving on, and the subject doesn't come up again for the rest of my training. She was right, though. I'd say about every 5th call I go on, I end up running across a set of stairs. Sometimes they're relatively close to the path, maybe within 2 or 3 miles. Sometimes they're 20, 30 miles out, literally in the middle of nowhere, and I only find them during the broadest searches or training weekends. They're usually in good condition, but sometimes it looks like they've been out there for miles. All different kinds, all different sizes. The biggest I ever saw looked like they came out of a turn-of-the-century mansion, and were at least 10 feet wide, with steps leading up at least 15 or 20 feet. I've tried talking about it with people, but they just give me the same response my trainer did.
It's normal. Don't worry about it. They're not a big deal, but don't go close to them or up to them.
When trainees ask me about it now, I give them the same response. I don't really know what else to tell them. I'm really hoping someday I get a better answer, but it hasn't happened yet. I'm guessing they are portals that lead to somewhere we don't want to go. One of the scariest things that I have ever had happen to me involved the search for a young woman who'd gotten separated from her hiking group. We were out until late at night because the dogs had picked up her scent. When we found her, she was curled up under a large rotted log. She was missing her shoes, and she was clearly in shock. She didn't have any injuries, and we were able to get her to walk with us back to base. Along the way, she kept looking behind us and asking us,
Why is that big man with black eyes following us?
At first, we were a little weirded out, but we couldn't see anyone, so we just wrote it off as some weird symptom of shock. But the closer we got to base, the more agitated this woman got. She kept asking me to tell him to stop making faces at her. At one point she stopped and turned around, and started yelling into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She said that she wasn't going to go with him, and she wouldn't give us to him. We finally got her to keep moving, but we started hearing these weird noises coming from all around us. It was almost like howling, but more rhythmic and deeper. I mean, it was almost insect-like. I don't really know how else to describe it. When we were within sight of the base, the woman turned to me, and her eyes were about as wide as I can imagine a human could open them. She touches my shoulder and says,
He says to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck.
I have a very small scar on the base of my neck, but it's mostly hidden under my collar, and I have no idea how this woman saw it. Right after she says it, I hear that weird coughing right in my ear, and I just jumped out of my skin. I hustled her to the base, trying not to show how freaked out I was, but I have to say I was really happy when we left the area that night. Even a few days later, I could not get that thought and incident out of my mind. And for some reason in my memory, I always had a black shadowy figure existing around us. Maybe it was me overthinking, but it was making me anxious. I wasn't experiencing it again, but I wanted some sort of closure. So I did some research and tried to find if there was any documentation of a similar episode before. But to my disappointment, there were none. So I tried to contact the lady from that day. It took me a while to fetch the details, but eventually, I ended up calling her. She met me over the weekend, and she told me everything that she remembered. I was expecting her to be rational while she spoke, as in I presumed that she would just mention that she was in shock, so she either did not remember anything or accepted that she was talking nuts. And then I would have mentioned about the scratch mark, which would get an interesting answer. But no, this was the opposite. She stood firm by her claims from the other day. She did not remember the details of the face. In her own words, she said that it was dark to notice the details of the face and could just see the silhouette. According to her, the voice of this entity was very deep and disturbing. When I mentioned to her about the scar, she looked perplexed. She wasn't aware that it was true and had rather forgotten about it. I showed her the scar and told her how it was impossible for her to have seen it under my collar. To which she felt relieved, as it indirectly proved that she wasn't going crazy. I asked her about how she had got there. She remembered hiking alone and then coming across some distant stench. She thought that there was some rotting animal carcass nearby. But when she walked into the treeline, she was maybe hypnotized or something, because she just couldn't retain any memory post that. The lady did remember sensing the feeling of dread and also felt like she was being chased by someone. And then, like in a dream, she reached the huge log where she felt she would be safe. And that was where we found her eventually. Before leaving, she suggested me to stay away from that part of the forest. I agreed and even left my job. I was teamed up with another search and rescue officer because we'd received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get to where we figured he'd be. We found him trapped in a small crevasse with a broken leg. It was not pleasant. He'd been there for almost 2 days, and his leg was very badly infected. We were able to get him into a chopper, and I heard from one of the emergency medical technicians that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He kept talking about how he'd been doing fine, and when he'd gotten to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment, and he was wearing a parka and ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said he had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he'd fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night, climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it. And that actually disturbed me because just a few days before this incident, I had a family that was out on a family weekend trip. The husband had called to complain about some man who was constantly hanging around their camp. The family claimed that he could be seen lurking around them ever since they had camped for lunch. They would see him hanging around the far-off trees. And when the husband got irritated, he even tried to walk up to him to confront him about it. But by the time he would reach him, he would be gone, as if he was never there. This happened a couple of times, and eventually, the family got paranoid. They packed up and called for help. We escorted them out, and nothing came off of it. But I remembered the little kid telling his mom in the back seat about the faceless man.